All right, let's dive in. Today, we're taking a look at moral particularism. It's a pretty interesting ethical theory, really gets you thinking about how we decide right from wrong. We're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on this. Have you ever felt like those hard and fast rules, the moral rules we're all taught, just like don't always fit the situation? Like sometimes doing the right thing well, it means bending the rules a little bit. That's kind of what we're going to be looking at today.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area. Moral particularism, it really challenges the assumptions we have about, universal moral principles. Do we really always have to tell the truth? Or, keep promises no matter what, no matter what's going on?
Right. So let's break this down a little bit. The source talks about two main types of moral principles, right? Absolute and contributory. Absolute principles are those black and white rules, no exceptions, never lie, for instance.
Makes sense.
And then contributory principles are more like, I guess you could say they're guidelines, things to consider when making decisions.
Right. Yeah, and that's a really important distinction. Take honesty. Generally, it's a good thing, right? But what if telling the truth, directly leads to someone getting hurt? Does honesty, still override everything else in that particular situation? Yeah.
That's where that whole particularist versus generalist thing comes in, right? The generalists, I think they'd probably say, stick to the principle, honesty above all else.
Right.
But particularists would probably say, hold on, it's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. Particularists, they emphasize that what's right or wrong. It's not just rigidly following some rule book. It's about carefully considering all the unique factors of a situation,
Right.
And they believe in this thing. It's called the holism of reasons. It's the idea that, reasons don't just exist on their own. They kind of interact and change each other's, significance depending on the situation.
Okay, that makes sense. But that also sounds pretty complicated. If they're not, relying on set principles, how do particularists actually go about making decisions? Do they just, go with their gut every time?
Well, it's not about just throwing out all reason and logic. It's more about recognizing the limitations of trying to apply those general principles to these really specific situations.
Yeah.
Think about
Yeah.
a doctor who has to decide whether to be completely honest with a patient about a really difficult diagnosis. Honesty is really important, of course, but so is the patient's emotional well-being. So how do those two factors combine in that case? There's no one principle that's going to give you
Nah.
a clear-cut answer there.
Yeah, no, that's a really powerful example. It makes you think about how difficult these moral decisions can be, especially when you've got so many things to consider.
Yeah, and the source actually brings up another interesting point just to kind of illustrate this idea about context and how it influences our reasons for believing things. So imagine, you take this drug, and it makes you see colors differently. Suddenly seeing something as red. It's no longer a good reason to believe that it's actually red.
Right.
Because your perception has been, it's been altered,
Yeah.
So the whole reason for that belief is just flipped.
Wow, it's a pretty mind-bending thought experiment. I mean,
Right.
if something as basic as color perception can be so drastically affected by, the context, imagine how much more complex those ethical judgments can be.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the particularists are getting at. They're kind of pushing us to be more attentive to the nuances of each situation.
Yeah.
Really think critically about, which factors matter and how they interact in that specific case.
So they're not saying, completely abandon your principles, but to be more cautious about just blindly applying them, without thinking about the specific circumstances. It's about being more morally attentive, as you were saying earlier.
Exactly. And that kind of leads us to some of the challenges that particularists pose to people who favor a more principle-based approach to ethics. They point out how relying solely on these absolute principles, it can lead to some tricky dilemmas.
Yeah, like that classic example of lying to protect someone from harm. If you have this principle of never lie, right? But then you also have this principle of protecting others. How do you choose which one matters more? It seems like there's more to morality than just following those rules, no matter how good they sound in isolation.
Right. Yeah, it kind of suggests this rigidity that doesn't always line up with our intuition about doing the right thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get it.
But then some people might say, well, okay, maybe those absolute principles are a little too strict. What about those contributory ones? They seem a little more flexible.
Yeah, contributory principles, they do seem like they strike a good
Yeah.
good balance. You're not bound by an absolute rule.
Yeah.
But you still have those guiding factors to think about.
Right, but even those contributory principles, they kind of face, well, they face some pushback from the particularist perspective.
Yeah.
They argue that
Yeah.
even if a factor usually matters, can we really say it always matters?
Right.
Like, take the example of promise keeping, right? Usually you make a promise. You should keep it, right?
Yeah.
But, like, what if you promise to do something that's, clearly immoral? Does that principle of keeping promises still, does it still apply in that kind of extreme case?
That's a really good point. Yeah. It shows how the context can completely change, the weight of something. That would normally be really important to consider. Are there any other examples of that kind of, that contextual flip in the source?
Yeah, actually, there are a few different ways that generalists try to defend their position. Some of them, they try to make those principles like more and more complex to try and account for all the possible exceptions.
Doesn't that kind of make things, a little more confusing? Imagine trying to apply a principle that has, 50 different, conditions and subclauses and stuff.
Exactly, yeah. And as the source points out, that approach, well, it gets really messy really fast. It loses that simplicity and that clarity that principles are supposed to provide.
Right.
So another defense is to focus on, those core virtues, things like honesty, kindness, courage, instead of, those specific principles.
Right, yeah. I can see how that's appealing, Virtues seem a little more adaptable to different situations, but I'm guessing the particularists would probably have something to say about that too.
Oh, they definitely do. They'd say even virtues, they aren't always so straightforward. Think about, being considerate to a cruel person.
Okay.
Does that virtue actually apply in that context? Or does it become something else?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So even virtues aren't, completely immune to those contextual shifts in meaning and relevance. It's making me realize that, this whole idea of moral reasoning, it's way more complex than just picking a principle and applying it everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And that complexity is what particulars are. They're urging us to embrace it. But it also it raises another question. If particularism and generalism, they have such different views on, moral reasoning, do those differences actually show up in how we make decisions in real life?
Yeah.
Or is it just, theoretical?
That's a great question. So does embracing particularism mean, throwing out all our past experiences and starting from scratch every time we face some sort of dilemma?
Well, not necessarily. Particularism, it doesn't completely throw out, the value of experience. It's more about being aware of those limitations, of using our past experiences as guides for how to act. You can't just say, well, this thing mattered in this one situation, so it must matter in this other one too, without really thinking about, the specifics of that current context.
Right. So it's like being informed by your experience, but not bound by it.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense. But I imagine there are some people who would find this whole, particularist approach a little unsettling.
Oh, absolutely. Particularism, it faces some pretty tough challenges. One of those common criticism is that it's too relativistic. People worry that without those, without those firm principles, morality becomes totally subjective. It's like anything goes as long as you can justify it.
Yeah, that's a worry I can definitely understand. There are no principles. How can we hold people accountable? How do we even know what's right and wrong if it's always shifting and changing?
Those are totally valid concerns. But particularists, they say it's not about, having no constraints at all. It's about having particular constraints. They acknowledge that every situation has its own, its own unique moral demands, even if those demands don't fit neatly into those predetermined categories.
Right. So it's not rejecting the idea of moral constraints altogether. It's more about rejecting the idea that they always have to be these universal principles. Is that kind of what they mean by moral attentiveness?
Exactly, yeah. It's about being sensitive to the complexities of the situation, to the different perspectives, and to the potential consequences of our actions. It's about recognizing that, making good moral judgments. It requires more than just applying some rule. It requires careful and nuanced thinking.
That's a really insightful way to put it. It kind of makes me wonder if particularism, in a way, puts even more emphasis on personal judgment, and responsibility than generalism does. But that also brings us to another common Another common concern about particularism, right? Doesn't all this emphasis on judgment, doesn't it make it easier for people to just make exceptions for themselves?
Right, that's the special pleading problem. Critics, they worry that without those those really firm rules, it becomes too easy to just like rationalize bad behavior. It's like,
Yeah.
well, it's wrong for everyone else to lie, but in my unique situation, it's fine.
Yeah. It's like it's almost like particularism gives people this free pass to just pick and choose,
Yeah.
which moral obligations they want to follow. So how do particularists,
Yeah.
how do they respond to that?
Well, they'd say that. The danger that, those self-serving justifications, it exists no matter, oh no, no matter what ethical system you're using. People are really good at, like,
Yeah.
reinterpreting rules or kind of bending them to fit what they want. Even when those rules seem really,
Yeah.
really clear.
Yeah, that's true.
And the source, it suggests that. The real safeguard here, whether you're,
Yeah.
a particularist or not, it's really rigorous self-reflection. Like, are we being honest with ourselves? Are we really willing to, like, scrutinize our motivations and,
Yeah.
and challenge our biases?
So it's not about finding some
So-
some perfect system that just eliminates all possibility of making a bad moral decision. It's about cultivating that mindset of just being really careful and critical when we think about, our actions
Yeah.
and how we justify them.
Exactly, yeah. And that kind of brings us back to that idea of, moral attentiveness. Maybe it's not just about
Yeah.
being sensitive to the nuances of the situation, but also to our own tendencies
Yeah.
to rationalize things or to make excuses for ourselves.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's a really important point. It's almost like particularism demands like a much higher level
Yeah.
of self-awareness and intellectual honesty. It's not just about, following the rules. It's about constantly examining and refining your own judgment.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, isn't it? This whole deep dive into moral particularism. It really pushes us to think beyond, those simple right or wrong answers. And it leaves us with some pretty interesting questions.
Yeah, for sure. Like if moral principles aren't the be all and end all, what does make someone a good person? Is it about
Right.
developing a certain kind of like moral perception, a way of seeing the world that's really attuned to these complexities?
Yeah, maybe it's about moving beyond that rule-based view of morality and embracing something a little more nuanced, something that's really sensitive to the context.
Absolutely. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on moral particularism? Does this change how you think about, your own moral compass? Join the conversation and let us know what you think.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. Until next time,
Yeah.
keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking out those ideas that make you really,
Yeah.
re-examine the world.